The death of the old order is at hand. It is being whispered in the bars, in the trolleys, in the theaters, and in our homes, particularly in our homes, where we at the bottom live. Those are the words of Ricardo Flores Magon, an architect of the Mexican Revolution. His name sits in the Chamber of Congress as one of the leaders, equal in stature to Zapata and Francisco Villa. My father was a Magonista and was part of his circle here in Los Angeles. My father was born 6 days and 114 years ago. He was born in 1900. He came to the United States when he was 18 years old, born in a small village, Villa Hidalgo, Jalisco, Los Altos de Jalisco. And this is his hat. He always dressed in a suit and tie, and most of the time I remember him in his hat. And he used to dress me up as a little boy. I have these really cute pictures. I'm all dressed up. I'm about this high, and I've got a tie on and a little hat. And wherever we went together, we were in a suit and tie. Living here in Boyle Heights, in Big Hazard, right next to Southern Pacific Railroad, San Bernardino Freeway. That was our backyard. We lived on the last house on the street. After that was a railroad. It was a 3-room, single-bedroom house. I slept in the living room on the couch. My aunt, who took care of me and my brother, in another side room. And my dad had the single tiny bedroom. The kids in the neighborhood called it the house with a kickstand. Had no backyard. It was a little cliff. And on the other side of the cliff was a stream and the railroad tracks. They went by 2-3 times a day and at night. And then the freeway. We had cousins that lived on the other side of the freeway, but their home was condemned, so the freeway could expand, and they had to move away. And a few years later, our home got condemned as well. Freeway grew, they knocked down our little tiny house, and we moved next door, and we were still the last house on the street. My dad was the hardest working man I've known. He worked 6 days a week, 12 hours a day, take the bus to Beverly Hills from Boyle Heights, and he'd get home 2 in the morning, 2:30. So I'd go to work, to school, my work, and he'd be asleep. I'd get home, and he'd be at work. He'd get home, and I'd be asleep. So I only saw him 1 day a week. I saw him on Mondays, the day that the restaurant was closed. When he came to the United States, he first worked on the railroads. And he went all the way up to Utah, Idaho. Then he worked his way back down, working in the fields. And he ended up here in 1919, working as a dishwasher. Then later as a cook. Then during the Second World War, he worked at Warner Brothers in the commissary. And then finally, year after I was born, 1949, 1950, he became the executive chef at La Scala restaurant in Beverly Hills, then one of the premier restaurants in the world. And I grew up hearing these fabulous stories that Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor had been there that night. Or even better, Maria Felix and Agustín Aguilar. Pedro Armendáriz had just been there. And he had come into the kitchen, and shook his hand. And Elizabeth Taylor, when she was making Cleopatra, demanded that his lima bean soup be airshipped to her, to Europe. Maybe it's not the only reason that that movie cost more than any movie up until that time. But he was part of that big giant fiasco. So people loved his food, and they called him Pancho. In the neighborhood, he was Don Francisco. To me, he was my compadre. We always went to the movies on Monday. We end up downtown in the afternoon after taking the bus, and we go to Clifton's. And I had Thanksgiving dinner every week. Turkey, stuffing, the mashed potatoes with cranberry sauce, and then pumpkin pie, little whipped cream. So then we'd walk down the street. We'd end up at the $1 Million Theater on 3rd and Broadway. And we'd see a Variedad. We'd have a great time. And I was a little kid. You know, my dad was taking me 5, 6, 7 years old, and he was a flirt. Boy, all the ladies loved him, right? You know, he'd say, you know, ¿por qué no te vas conmigo a Acapulco? You know, let's take a trip. They all knew he was a widower. 2 wives had died on him young. My mother died when I was 1.5 years old. So, you know, this elegantly dressed man, little kid, also in a suit and tie, ladies loved him. But he didn't get married again. He said he didn't want to give me a stepmother. After, you know, we'd go to the Variedad and see whoever was there, Tongolele in particular, I remember. I snuck up on backstage, and he went back and looked for me, and he found me on her lap. She was an exotic dancer, so I knew where to go. Then we'd walk down, all the way down to the California Theater, which was on Los Angeles Street, 8th, 9th, and we'd see a Mexican movie. And then we'd walk back, and maybe we'd end up at the State Seat Theater. We'd see 2, 3 movies a night. It'd be 1 in the morning, we'd catch the bus, get home around 2. Teachers were very accustomed to the fact that I'd always arrive to school late. They'd leave my stuff out, right? They knew that I'd get there by 10. It was that way my entire elementary school career. You know, I was up with my dad. He was up at night because he had to work nights, and the one day that we were together, I was with him. Since my mother had died, you know, he was my mother and father. And we spent tremendous times together. We'd walk up and down Brooklyn, and he loved to go into the merchants. And they'd talk politics, philosophy, religion. They'd talk about the war. They'd talk about what had been going on. And then I heard him talking, you know, something that sounded a little bit off to me. And then he explained to me that it was Ladino. And he had a great time talking to all the Safarditas who had shops here on Brooklyn Avenue. And there were all these folks that were speaking an ancient Spanish. And so he told me about how the Inquisition had expelled the Jews and the Moors from Spain, and how so many Mexicans were actually Jews. They were conversos, and they had decided better to change their religion than to get burned at the stake. And then he told me how the Inquisition in his home territory had burned at the stake Carvajal, General Carvajal, who had populated Los Altos de Jalisco, and his family, and the peasants that were there, and even the dogs. So he talked to me about history. He talked to me about the hypocrisy of religions. And he talked to me about the injustice that had been fallen nosotros los mexicanos. For the longest time, I thought that a Spaniard was called a pinche gachupin. I thought that was their actual names. And then I learned that, of course, it was because of his knowledge and education, having only gotten to the 4th grade, of history that he had shared with me about Mexico and what it had been, the grandeur of the civilizations there, and what the Spaniards had done, and what they had destroyed, and how the Toltecs and the Aztecs and the Mayas had a far more sophisticated and profound understanding of the cosmos than was comprehended by the Europeans of the time. I remember he took me to go see all of the movies on the Revolution. I have seared into my memory the image of peasant Indians being hung, who had rebelled for wanting their freedom. Their recompense was being lynched. And he told me the stories of the American Marines who had invaded Mexico and blockaded, and of the hungers that they had passed during the Mexican Revolution because of the blockades, and of the incursion of General Pershing into Mexico, chasing Francisco Villa after Villa went for his money since he had paid for ammunition, and the United States had sent him ammunition that no longer worked, since they no longer favored him in the revolution. And how the most important, powerful man in Mexico City was a U.S. ambassador. He had been selected by his own little town to go to the Constitutional Convention of Aguascalientes. But his father at that time wanted him to go live with his uncle, who was a priest, and to either study for the priesthood or to go back and tend the cows. So when he got an invitation from a cousin to go north, he left all of it and came here, where he could be free, and where he joined up with Flores Magon. So his heroes became my heroes: Zapata, Villa, Cura Hidalgo, Jose Martí, Bolivar, Abraham Lincoln. He loved ideas. They were powerful to him. He loved the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights. He knew them. But he also taught me of the hypocrisy of politicians. When the Chicano movement burst, I desperately wanted his approval. Because of what he had taught me, I was there. I was arrested. I was indicted by the grand jury of Los Angeles twice. Faced life in jail. Was a fugitive. Had to arrange for my own surrender. Family members called my dad. They had seen me on the front page of the LA Times in shackles. And they complained. They said I was giving the family a bad name. He never mentioned a word to me about that. 10 years later, I found out. He supported me the whole time. I asked him about the word Chicano. Did he know it? Because in the neighborhood, we were all Chicanos. It wasn't a big deal. You're either a Chicano, a Gabacho, or a Mayate, or a Buddha head. Now, I didn't know some of those words were kind of derogatory, or all of them. And he explained to me that when he was a kid in Los Altos de Jalisco, Chicano was a word that wasn't favored because it was applied to the Indians. They called themselves that. And the people that were educated, gente de razón, didn't want to have anything to do with them. So I remember that all of the educated people in the neighborhood, they all looked down on the word. But he told me It was the same word as Mexicano. And Mexicanos and Chicanos was the same thing. They were both Nahuatl words and had the same root, Mexica. I miss him. He died in 1980. I was 31. Just recently married, 2 children. But he taught me that death was a new beginning. And when I was a little boy, he said that long ago, humans were closer to their Creator. And they knew when their time was coming. And they would gather their family and say goodbye to them. Because they knew when their time was come to leave. And it was a celebration, not a time of sorrow, not a time of grief. It was a new beginning. So I remember that, and he's with me. He's with me now.